On March 4, 1193, in Damascus, the most powerful sultan in the Muslim world lay dying. Saladin, the man who had united Egypt, Syria, and the Holy Lands under one banner, who had shattered the Crusader armies at Hattin, who had reconquered Jerusalem after 88 years of Christian occupation, who had fought Richard the Lionheart to a standstill, was succumbing to fever. He was only 55 years old, but decades of relentless campaigning had exhausted him. As religious scholars and family members gathered around his deathbed, an imam recited passages from the Quran. When the recitation reached the verse, "He is God, than whom there is no other deity," witnesses reported that Saladin smiled faintly, whispered "true," and died. What happened next shocked everyone. When Saladin's treasurer inventoried the Sultan's estate, he found almost nothing. The man who ruled from the Nile to the Euphrates, who commanded armies of tens of thousands, who received tribute from dozens of cities, had died with 47 dirhams of silver and a single gold piece to his name, not even enough to pay for his own funeral. Saladin had given everything away, to his soldiers, to the poor, to fund the endless jihad against the Crusaders, to build mosques and schools, to anyone who asked. His son Al-Afdal had to borrow money to bury his father. This paradox, immense power combined with voluntary poverty, captured perfectly the complexity of the man Europeans called Saladin. Muslims knew as Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, and history remembers as perhaps the most celebrated Muslim commander of the medieval period. He was the Sultan who made even his Christian enemies respect him. Richard the Lionheart called him the greatest and most powerful leader in the Islamic world. Crusader chronicles, usually hostile to Muslim leaders, described him as generous, chivalrous, and just. Dante, writing a century later, placed Saladin in limbo rather than hell, the only Muslim leader granted this honor in the Divine Comedy, because of his virtue. But who was Saladin really? Strip away the legends accumulated over 8 centuries, the romanticization by Victorian Europeans fascinated by Oriental chivalry, the idealization by modern Muslims seeking a golden age hero, and the political appropriations by various movements. What remains? Was he the pious warrior saint of Islamic tradition, fighting purely for faith and justice? Was he the calculating politician and strategic genius who manipulated religious sentiment to build personal power? Was he the model of knightly virtue that Christian chroniclers portrayed? An honorary member of the chivalric code despite being Muslim? The answer, as always with historical figures elevated to myth, is more complicated and more interesting than legend suggests. Saladin was a Kurdish soldier born into a military family of modest distinction who found himself thrust into the center of the 12th century's greatest geopolitical struggle, the collision between Christian Europe's crusading movement and the Islamic world's resistance. He was a man who genuinely believed in jihad as both spiritual obligation and political program, but who also delayed that jihad for years while he conquered Muslim territories to build the power base necessary to challenge the Crusaders. He showed remarkable mercy at Jerusalem, but executed prisoners after Hattin. He respected Richard the Lionheart while fighting him desperately for 3 years. He was pious but pragmatic, generous but ambitious, merciful but ruthless when necessary. This is not the story of a simple hero or villain. Medieval history rarely offers such clean categories. This is the story of how Saladin rose from relative obscurity to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria, how he united a fractured Muslim world through combination of force and persuasion, how he engineered one of medieval history's most decisive military victories at Hattin, how he recaptured Jerusalem through a campaign that combined strategic brilliance with calculated mercy, how he faced the Crusader counterattack and Richard the Lionheart's military genius, and how he died nearly penniless despite ruling an empire. More than that, this is the story of how a historical figure becomes a legend, how Saladin's reputation transcended his own time and religion to become a symbol invoked by Christians and Muslims, medievals and moderns, warriors and peacemakers alike. Understanding Saladin requires understanding the world that shaped him, a world of competing dynasties and religious fervor, of crusader kingdoms carved into the Islamic heartland and Muslim resistance building toward critical mass, of sophisticated court politics and brutal medieval warfare, of genuine religious devotion and calculated political ambition existing simultaneously in the same person. The legend of Saladin began before he died and has never ended. But the man behind the legend is even more compelling than the myth. This is his story, from the Kurdish military family in Tikrit to the Sultan's deathbed in Damascus, from the fractured Muslim world to the unified resistance, from the disaster at Hattin for the Crusaders to the victory at Jerusalem, from the struggle with Richard to the peace that left Jerusalem in Muslim hands. This is Saladin, the man who defied kings and crusaders, who united an empire and reclaimed a holy city, who became in his own lifetime and forever after both historical figure and timeless symbol. Saladin was born Yusuf ibn Ayyub in the town of Tikrit in 1138, the same year that the Crusader county of Edessa, one of the 4 Crusader states established after the First Crusade, came under attack from the rising Muslim power Zengi of Mosul. His birth name meant Joseph, son of Job, names resonant with Islamic tradition's prophets of patience and righteousness. His later title, Salah ad-Din, meant righteousness of the faith, granted to him much later after he had proven himself worthy of such an honorific. He was Kurdish, from a people who occupied the mountainous regions between Arab, Persian, and Turkish territories, a minority ethnicity that had produced soldiers for centuries, but rarely rulers. His family was respectable but not distinguished, part of the military class serving the Zengid dynasty that controlled northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The world into which Saladin was born was one of political fragmentation and military crisis for the Muslim lands. The unity that had characterized the early Abbasid Caliphate, when a single caliph in Baghdad commanded the loyalty of the entire Sunni Muslim world, was a distant memory. By the 12th century, the Abbasid Caliph remained as a religious figurehead in Baghdad, but held no real political or military power. Actual authority belonged to competing Turkish military dynasties, the Seljuks nominally ruling from Isfahan, but controlling increasingly little territory, the Zengids in Syria and northern Mesopotamia, various local emirs holding individual cities, and in Egypt the Fatimid Caliphate, a rival Shia dynasty that rejected Abbasid legitimacy and had its own caliph in Cairo. This fragmentation would not have been merely an internal Muslim concern except for one catastrophic fact. Christian Crusaders occupied the Levantine coast. In 1099, the First Crusade had captured Jerusalem, slaughtering most of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in an orgy of religiously motivated violence. The Crusaders had established 4 states along the eastern Mediterranean: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These Frankish kingdoms, as Muslims called all Crusaders, regardless of actual origin, controlled key trade routes, holy sites sacred to Islam including Jerusalem and the Dome of the Rock, and productive agricultural lands. They were militarily formidable, with heavily armored night cavalry that Muslim forces struggled to counter, sophisticated siege technology, and fortifications that seemed nearly impregnable. What made the Crusader presence particularly galling was not just that they occupied Muslim territory, but that Muslim disunity made effective resistance nearly impossible. The Sunni Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad and the Shia Fatimid Caliph in Cairo hated each other more than either hated the Crusaders. Turkish emirs competed for territory and power, often preferring to ally with Crusaders against Muslim rivals rather than present a united front. The second generation of Crusaders, those born in Outremer, the Crusader name for their territories, rather than arriving from Europe, had learned Arabic, adopted Eastern customs, and developed complex diplomatic and military relationships with neighboring Muslim rulers, sometimes fighting them, sometimes allying with them against other Muslims or other Crusaders. The situation was a chaotic web of shifting alliances, where religious identity was just one factor among many in determining who allied with whom. Into this world of complexity and crisis, young Yusuf ibn Ayyub was born. His father, Najm ad-Din Ayyub, was a military commander under the Zengid governor of Tikrit. When Yusuf was still an infant, his father became embroiled in local political conflicts, was forced to flee Tikrit, and brought his family to Mosul and then Damascus, seeking service with the Zengid dynasty. This early displacement meant Saladin's childhood was spent not in the Kurdish highlands of his ethnicity, but in Damascus, the great city of Syria, capital of the Zengid domain after Zengi's son Nur al-Din established control there. Damascus was an ideal place for a young man of military family to be educated. It was a center of Islamic learning, with madrasas, educational institutions, teaching both religious sciences and what we might call secular subjects: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. Young Saladin received a thorough education in Sunni Islamic jurisprudence, according to the Shafi'i school, Quranic studies, and Hadith, prophetic traditions. He also studied Arabic literature and poetry. He would later be known for his eloquent letters and appreciation for verse. Equally important, Damascus was a military camp in preparation for jihad. Nur al-Din, Saladin's overlord and the man he would both serve and learn from, was the first Muslim leader since the Crusades began to seriously organize sustained military resistance to the Crusader states, framing that resistance in explicitly religious terms as jihad, holy war to reclaim Muslim lands. The concept of jihad that Saladin absorbed in Nur al-Din's Damascus was both spiritual and practical. Spiritually, it was one of Islam's core obligations, the struggle to protect the faith and the faithful. Practically, it was the political program that could unite competing Muslim factions. Nur al-Din understood that to mobilize resources for war against the Crusaders, he needed to present himself as the legitimate leader of Islamic resistance. This meant not just military success, but demonstrating piety, justice, and commitment to Islamic law. Nur al-Din built madrasas, patronized religious scholars, lived relatively simply, and consistently proclaimed that his conquests of other Muslim territories were necessary to unite the Muslims against the greater Christian threat. Young Saladin, serving first as a companion to Nur al-Din and then in minor administrative and military roles, learned these lessons well. He saw how religious legitimacy could translate into political power. He witnessed the importance of combining military force with religious propaganda. He observed Nur al-Din's method of surrounding himself with religious scholars who provided theological justification for his actions. These lessons would serve Saladin well in the decades ahead. But in his 20s, Saladin seemed destined for a respectable but unremarkable career as a mid-level military commander. He was known for his intelligence and administrative capability, but not particularly for martial prowess or command presence. His real talent seemed to be organization and logistics rather than battlefield leadership. This made him useful but not exceptional in a world full of ambitious warriors. There was no indication that this quiet, studious young man would become anything more than a competent officer in someone else's army. Everything changed with Egypt. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo was collapsing from internal weakness, court intrigue, and multiple invasions. Both Nur al-Din's Syria and the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem understood that whoever controlled Egypt, with its enormous wealth from agriculture and trade, would dominate the region. The Nile's annual floods made Egypt the richest agricultural territory in the medieval Middle East. Its position controlling trade routes between the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean made Cairo one of the world's great commercial centers. The Fatimids themselves were politically and militarily exhausted, their army dominated by competing factions, their caliph reduced to a puppet of various viziers who murdered each other in rapid succession. Between 1163 and 1169, Syria and Jerusalem launched multiple competing expeditions into Egypt, each trying to either install a friendly vizier in Cairo or conquer Egypt outright. Saladin's uncle, Shirkuh, was Nur al-Din's leading commander and led 3 expeditions to Egypt. Initially, Saladin was reluctant to join these campaigns. According to later biographies, he preferred his comfortable position in Damascus to the dangers of war in Egypt. But family duty and his father's insistence compelled him to accompany his uncle. These Egyptian campaigns would transform Saladin from a minor commander into a political player. In the complex 3-way struggle between Zengid Syria, Crusader Jerusalem, and Fatimid Egypt, with various Egyptian factions playing the foreign powers against each other, Saladin proved himself not just competent, but exceptional. At the Battle of Al-Babain in 1167, when Shirkuh's forces were surrounded by a combined Crusader Egyptian army, Saladin commanded the center of the Muslim line, while Shirkuh led a flanking maneuver. Saladin's division held under intense Crusader cavalry charges, allowing Shirkuh to strike the enemy from behind and turn near defeat into victory. This was Saladin's first major military success, revealing abilities he perhaps had not known he possessed. More importantly, Saladin demonstrated political acumen in navigating Cairo's labyrinthine court politics. When Shirkuh briefly became Fatimid vizier in 1169, Saladin served as his deputy, learning the mechanisms of Egyptian governance and cultivating relationships with key military commanders and administrators. When Shirkuh died suddenly after only 2 months as vizier, possibly from overeating at a banquet, according to some accounts, the Fatimid court appointed the 31-year-old Saladin as vizier, apparently believing this relatively young and inexperienced outsider could be controlled. They had made a fatal miscalculation. Saladin proved far more capable and ambitious than anyone had anticipated. Within months, he had consolidated control over Egypt's military, replaced Fatimid administrators with his own men, and established himself as the real power in Egypt, while the Fatimid Caliph became an irrelevant figurehead. Saladin was now vizier of Egypt, ostensibly serving the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo while actually serving Nur al-Din in Damascus, while actually building his own independent power base. This complex triple game, appearing subordinate while accumulating autonomous authority, would characterize the next phase of Saladin's career. The stage was set. A Kurdish soldier of modest origins had become master of Egypt through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and fortunate timing. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the abolition of a 250-year-old caliphate, the construction of a new empire, the unification of Muslim Syria and Egypt for the first time in centuries, and eventually the confrontation with the Crusaders that would make Saladin's name legendary. The reluctant soldier, who had preferred Damascus comforts to Egyptian campaigns, had discovered he had a talent for power, and once discovered, that talent would reshape the medieval Middle East. Egypt in 1169 was a prize that 3 powers desperately wanted: the Zengid dynasty ruling Syria, the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, and various factions within Egypt itself. The Fatimid Caliphate, which had once ruled from North Africa to Syria and had been a serious rival to the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, was now a hollow shell. The Fatimid Caliph was a teenage puppet with no real authority. Power belonged to whoever could control the military and the position of vizier, the chief minister who actually ran the government. For the previous decade, viziers had been assassinated or deposed. With regular frequency as various court factions struggled for dominance, Saladin's uncle Shirkuh had led 3 military expeditions into Egypt on behalf of Nur al-Din between 1164 and 1169. These campaigns were complex, affairs involving not just military conquest but manipulation of Egyptian factions. Sometimes Shirkuh's forces allied with one Egyptian faction against another. Sometimes they fought alongside Crusader armies as part of temporary alliances. Sometimes they battled against Crusader forces trying to conquer Egypt for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The situation was fluid, treacherous, and created opportunities for skilled political operators. Saladin accompanied his uncle on the 3rd expedition reluctantly. According to his biographer Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who knew Saladin personally, the young man felt like someone going to his death when ordered to march to Egypt. He preferred his position in Damascus and saw no benefit in the dangerous Egyptian venture. But when Shirkuh insisted, and Saladin's father Ayyub commanded his son to go, Saladin obeyed. This decision would change his life and eventually change the course of the Crusades. The third Egyptian expedition in 1169 succeeded where previous ones had failed. Shirkuh's army entered Cairo not as conquerors, but as invited allies of one court faction against another. Once in Cairo with military force at his disposal, Shirkuh quickly outmaneuvered his supposed allies and had himself appointed vizier by the powerless Fatimid Caliph. Shirkuh was now, in theory, the second most powerful man in Egypt after the Caliph. In practice, with the army behind him, he was the most powerful. Saladin served as his uncle's right hand, commanding military operations and beginning to establish relationships with Egyptian military commanders, many of whom were fellow Sunni Muslims uncomfortable with serving a Shia Fatimid regime. Then fate intervened. On March 23, 1169, just 2 months after becoming vizier, Shirkuh died suddenly. Some sources say he ate so much at a banquet that he died of indigestion or overeating, a pathetic end for a warrior who had survived decades of combat. Other sources suggest poison, though this remains speculation. Regardless of cause, his death created a sudden power vacuum in Cairo. Who would succeed him as vizier? The Fatimid court officials assumed they could now appoint a weak, controllable vizier and recover some of their lost power. Saladin's youth, he was only 31, and his lack of independent reputation made him seem like an ideal puppet. The army supported his appointment because he was Shirkuh's nephew and represented continuity. Nur al-Din in Damascus approved because Saladin was from his court and would, theoretically, keep Egypt as a Zengid dependency. Everyone believed they could control or manipulate this young man. Everyone was wrong. Saladin moved immediately to consolidate his position with a combination of careful political maneuvering and decisive force when necessary. His first challenge came from within the army itself. Many of Shirkuh's veteran commanders resented being subordinate to this young man, who they saw as inexperienced. Several plots emerged to remove him. Saladin discovered these conspiracies and dealt with them ruthlessly, executing ringleaders, exiling potential troublemakers, and promoting loyal officers. Within months, the army understood that the quiet young administrator was willing to kill to maintain power. Simultaneously, Saladin cultivated support from Egyptian society beyond just the military. He worked with Sunni religious scholars who had chafed under Shia Fatimid rule, presenting himself as a pious Sunni Muslim who would restore proper Islamic practices. He ensured government administration continued smoothly, keeping capable Egyptian officials in place rather than replacing everyone with outsiders. He maintained existing tax policies to keep revenue flowing while showing mercy to those who petitioned for relief. The message was clear. Saladin intended to rule effectively, justly, and permanently. But a fundamental problem remained. Saladin was vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, theoretically serving the Shia Caliph in Cairo, while actually serving the Sunni Nur al-Din in Damascus, while actually building his own power base. This contradictory position couldn't last forever. The question was when and how to resolve it. The answer came in 1171 when the Fatimid Caliph al-Adid was dying. Saladin took the momentous step of abolishing the Fatimid Caliphate entirely. On September 10, 1171, Saladin ordered that the Friday sermon in Cairo's mosques, traditionally, where the ruler's name was recited as a sign of legitimate authority, include the name of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad instead of the Fatimid Caliph in Cairo. This seemingly religious gesture had profound political implications. It meant that Egypt now recognized the Sunni Abbasid Caliph as the legitimate leader of the Muslim world, rejecting the Shia Fatimid claim. It meant that the 262-year-old Fatimid Caliphate was finished, and it meant that Saladin was now the Sultan of Egypt, ruling in the name of the Abbasid Caliph and theoretically under the authority of Nur al-Din in Damascus, but actually as an independent power. The transition occurred with remarkable smoothness. The Fatimid Caliph al-Adid, died within days of the announcement, reportedly heartbroken at the news of his dynasty's abolition, but unable to resist. There was no significant resistance from Egyptian society. The Fatimid Caliphate had become so irrelevant that its abolition caused barely a ripple. The army, already loyal to Saladin personally, saw no reason to object. The Sunni Muslim majority in Egypt likely welcomed the restoration of orthodoxy. Within weeks, one of medieval Islam's major dynasties had vanished so quietly that historians debate whether anyone in Egypt even noticed beyond the immediate court circle. But abolishing the Fatimids created a new problem: Saladin's relationship with Nur al-Din. As long as Saladin was vizier of the Fatimid Caliphate, his position was complicated and somewhat independent. As Sultan of Egypt serving Nur al-Din, he was theoretically Nur al-Din's subordinate, who should obey his master's orders. Nur al-Din certainly saw it that way. He began demanding that Saladin bring Egyptian revenues and troops to Syria for campaigns against the Crusaders. Saladin complied partially, sending some money and some troops, but always finding reasons why he couldn't send more or come personally to Syria. The relationship became increasingly tense. Nur al-Din was no fool. He understood that Saladin was building independent power in Egypt and resisting full subordination. Saladin, for his part, couldn't openly defy Nur al-Din without losing the legitimacy that came from serving the great jihad leader, but also couldn't afford to fully submit and lose his independence. The situation required careful navigation. Saladin sent respectful letters to Nur al-Din, sent gifts, sent some troops, but always maintained Egyptian autonomy. He claimed to be preparing Egypt for greater participation in jihad, but needed time to consolidate. He suggested his continued presence in Egypt was necessary to prevent it from falling back into chaos or Crusader hands. This delicate balancing act might have eventually led to open conflict, but in 1174, Nur al-Din died unexpectedly and everything changed again. Nur al-Din was only 56, but had worn himself out with constant military campaigning. His death created a succession crisis in Syria. His heir was a boy, as Salih Ismail, only 11 years old. Various emirs competed for power as regents or guardians of the young prince. The united front that Nur al-Din had built against the Crusaders began fragmenting immediately. For Saladin, Nur al-Din's death was both opportunity and danger. The opportunity was clear. With Nur al-Din gone and Syria fragmenting, Saladin could potentially unite Syria and Egypt under his own rule, creating a power base large enough to seriously threaten the Crusader states. The danger was equally clear. If Saladin marched on Syria to take control, he would be seen as a usurper attacking the legitimate Zengid heir, betraying his former master's dynasty. How could he claim to be fighting for Islamic unity and jihad if he was conquering Muslim territories? Saladin's solution was to move carefully, using both military force and careful propaganda. He began by framing his actions as protecting the young as Salih Ismail. He argued that Syria was descending into chaos with competing emirs fighting each other, leaving the region vulnerable to Crusader attack. He positioned himself as the loyal servant coming to restore order and protect Nur al-Din's legacy. It was a thin justification that fooled no one who understood the reality. Saladin was seizing power, but it provided enough religious and political cover to make his conquest palatable. Over the next decade, Saladin would systematically bring Syria under his control through a combination of military campaigns, diplomatic marriages, economic incentives, and persistent propaganda about jihad. It was a masterful political campaign that demonstrated Saladin's true genius was not, primarily as a battlefield commander, though he was competent there, but as a political strategist who understood how to combine force with legitimacy, conquest with religious justification, ambition with apparent piety. The Kurdish soldier who had reluctantly marched to Egypt in 1169 was now, by 1174, Sultan of Egypt and poised to become master of Syria. The reluctant warrior had discovered he had a gift for power politics. The man who preferred scholarship to campaigning had found he excelled at the ruthless game of medieval statecraft. and the soldier, who had seemed destined for modest success, had positioned himself to attempt what no Muslim leader had accomplished since the First Crusade: the unification of Egypt and Syria under one ruler, committed to jihad against the Crusader states. But first he would have to complete the conquest of Syria, facing opposition not from Crusaders but from Muslims who saw him as an usurper and traitor to Nur al-Din's legacy. The next phase of Saladin's rise would reveal another dimension of his character: the determination to conquer fellow Muslims in the name of eventual war against Christians, and the propaganda skill to make that morally questionable project appear righteous. When Nur al-Din died in 1174, leaving an 11-year-old son as heir to his Syrian territories, the Muslim lands faced a familiar crisis: political fragmentation, precisely when unity was most needed to counter the Crusader threat. Damascus, Aleppo, Mosul, and lesser cities all had local rulers or regents claiming authority. Some genuinely supported the young As-Salih Ismail as Nur al-Din's legitimate heir. Others used the succession crisis to pursue their own independence. None wanted to submit to Saladin, the Egyptian upstart who had risen from relative obscurity to sultan in just 5 years. Saladin's central challenge from 1174 to 1186 was to unite Muslim Syria and Egypt under his personal rule while maintaining the claim that he was acting righteously for Islam rather than from personal ambition. This required a propaganda masterpiece. He had to convince the Muslim world that his conquest of Muslim territories was actually preparation for jihad against the Christians, that attacking fellow Muslims was regrettable but necessary for the greater goal of reclaiming Jerusalem, that he was Nur al-Din's true heir in spirit if not blood. The messaging began immediately. In letters to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, to religious scholars throughout the Muslim world, and in Friday sermons in mosques he controlled, Saladin presented himself as the defender of Sunni orthodoxy, the protector of the young Zengid heir, and the coordinator preparing Muslim forces for the Great Jihad. He emphasized that Syrian emirs were fighting each other rather than fighting Crusaders, leaving Muslim territory vulnerable. He argued that someone needed to impose unity, and since he controlled Egypt's resources and army, he was best positioned to do so. Most importantly, he framed every military campaign against fellow Muslims as a preliminary step toward the real goal: Jerusalem. This framing was both cynical and sincere. Saladin contained multitudes. He genuinely believed in jihad and genuinely intended to fight the Crusaders, but he was also genuinely ambitious and understood that controlling Syria's strategic territory and resources was necessary before he could challenge Crusader military power. The conquest of Muslim territories was both principled preparation and personal power building. Understanding Saladin requires holding both truths simultaneously. His campaign to control Syria began in late 1174 when he marched north from Egypt with an army and occupied Damascus, which surrendered without significant resistance. The city's notables and military commanders had known Saladin during his years serving Nur al-Din and preferred him to the chaos of competing claimants. Damascus would remain Saladin's primary capital for the rest of his life. He loved the city and invested heavily in its infrastructure, building schools, hospitals, and fortifications. Aleppo was more difficult. This great northern Syrian city remained loyal to the Zengid dynasty and viewed Saladin as a usurper. Saladin besieged Aleppo in 1175 but couldn't take it by force. The siege ended in negotiation. Saladin withdrew in exchange for recognition of his authority elsewhere. He would return to the Aleppo question later. This pattern of combined military pressure with negotiated settlement would characterize much of his Syrian campaign. Saladin understood that Muslim Syria couldn't be conquered through pure force. He needed the conquered to accept his rule willingly, or at least without deep resentment that would create permanent resistance. During this period, Saladin faced an unusual and dangerous threat: the assassins. The Nizari Ismailis, commonly called assassins by Crusaders and Muslims alike, were a Shia sect that held a network of mountain fortresses in Syria and Persia. They were famous for their tactic of infiltrating enemy courts and killing key leaders. Hence our modern word assassination derived from their name. The assassins opposed Saladin for multiple reasons. He had abolished the Shia Fatimid Caliphate. He threatened the independence of small Muslim states like theirs, and they saw his power as dangerous to their survival. In 1175, assassins infiltrated Saladin's camp during a siege and attempted to kill him. The attack was nearly successful. Several assassins disguised as soldiers got close enough to wound Saladin before his guards killed them. Saladin survived with minor injuries, but the psychological impact was significant. A second assassination attempt in 1176 came even closer to success. Assassins again infiltrated his camp, this time attacking at night. Saladin survived only because he had started sleeping in a wooden tower with guards posted, and because he was wearing armor even while sleeping. Paranoia that saved his life. After the second attempt, Saladin responded not with military assault on the assassin fortresses, which would have been costly and difficult, but with negotiation. He came to an understanding with the assassins. They would stop targeting him and his family, and he would leave their fortresses alone and grant them autonomy. This practical arrangement held for the rest of Saladin's life. It demonstrated his pragmatism. He didn't need to conquer everyone, just neutralize threats and build workable relationships. The assassins remained independent but stopped being enemies, and Saladin could focus elsewhere. Conquest of Aleppo became urgent after Saladin defeated a combined force of Zengid Aleppo and its Crusader allies at the Battle of the Horns of Hammer in 1175. This victory demonstrated that Zengid military power was not sufficient to stop him and that even Crusader assistance couldn't preserve Zengid independence. However, Aleppo still refused to submit. The city's loyalty to Nur al-Din's dynasty was genuine, and many there viewed Saladin as a traitor to his former master. Saladin's solution was patient pressure combined with generosity. He continued periodic military pressure while simultaneously sending messages, emphasizing that he meant no harm to the young Salih Ismail personally, that he sought unity against Crusaders rather than personal power, and that those who joined him would be rewarded. He arranged marriage alliances between his family and Zengid family. He showered potential allies with gifts and positions. Slowly, Aleppo's resistance eroded. The breakthrough came in 1183 when Salih Ismail died at age 20. The boy king's death removed the emotional center of Zengid loyalty. Without a living heir of Nur al-Din to rally around, resistance to Saladin became untenable. Aleppo negotiated surrender in 1183, and Saladin entered the city peacefully. He treated the city's notable families with respect, maintained existing administrative arrangements, and demonstrated that submission to his rule meant stability rather than upheaval. Mosul, the remaining major Zengid stronghold in northern Mesopotamia, proved even more difficult. The rulers of Mosul had deeper resources and were further from Saladin's Egyptian base, making conquest more difficult. Saladin launched several campaigns against Mosul between 1182 and 1186, but couldn't force its submission. Eventually, a negotiated settlement emerged. Mosul would maintain nominal independence under its Zengid rulers, but would recognize Saladin's overall authority and provide troops for his campaigns. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but allowed Saladin to present himself as having united the Muslim lands from Egypt to northern Mesopotamia. Throughout this period of Muslim-on-Muslim warfare, Saladin maintained a careful propaganda campaign. He commissioned religious scholars to write treatises justifying his actions. He sent letters to the Abbasid Caliph seeking official recognition of his conquests. He built madrasas, religious schools, and khanqahs, Sufi lodges, in every city he controlled, demonstrating his piety and commitment to Islamic learning. He patronized religious scholars and gave generously to the poor. The message was consistent. Saladin was a pious Muslim warrior preparing for jihad, not an ambitious conqueror pursuing personal power. This propaganda was both effective and partly true. Saladin genuinely was pious. He prayed regularly, studied hadith, enjoyed the company of religious scholars, and tried to rule according to Islamic principles. He also genuinely intended to fight the Crusaders, but he was also genuinely ambitious and understood that piety and jihad provided excellent cover for empire building. Medieval people were no more naive than modern ones. Many understood exactly what Saladin was doing, but his success, his apparent sincerity, and the genuine Crusader threat made it possible to accept his rule as legitimate. A key moment came in 1175 when the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad officially recognized Saladin as Sultan of Egypt and Syria. This recognition provided crucial legitimacy. Saladin could now claim he ruled not through usurpation, but through the Caliph's authority. That this recognition came only after Saladin had already conquered most of his territory through force was conveniently ignored. What mattered was that the symbolic head of Sunni Islam had blessed Saladin's rule. By 1186, Saladin controlled a unified territory stretching from Egypt through Palestine and Syria to northern Mesopotamia. He had accomplished something no Muslim leader had achieved since the First Crusade: the creation of a single political military structure surrounding the Crusader states on three sides. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem was now geographically isolated, trapped between Saladin's Egypt to the south and Saladin's Syria to the north and east. The county of Tripoli and Principality of Antioch were cut off from Jerusalem. The strategic situation had been completely reversed from the early Crusade period, when divided Muslim powers faced unified Crusader states. Now a unified Muslim power under Saladin surrounded divided and increasingly isolated Crusader territories. This strategic achievement was the product of 12 years of careful political military work. Saladin had fought wars against fellow Muslims, negotiated complex agreements, survived assassination attempts, built an administrative state, maintained propaganda campaigns, cultivated religious legitimacy, and finally created the power base necessary to threaten Crusader power seriously. He had demonstrated that he was not just a capable military commander, but a sophisticated political operator who understood how to combine force, persuasion, patronage, propaganda, and religious legitimacy to build an empire. The Kurdish soldier who had reluctantly marched to Egypt in 1169 was now, in 1186, master of the largest unified Muslim territory in the Middle East since the collapse of Seljuk power. The man who had preferred scholarship to warfare now commanded armies of tens of thousands. The young administrator who had seemed unlikely to achieve greatness had built an empire, and that empire, as Saladin had consistently claimed, had one primary purpose: jihad against the Crusaders and the reconquest of Jerusalem. For 12 years, Saladin had been preparing. For 12 years, he had promised that his conquest of Muslim territories was preliminary to the real war against the Christians. For 12 years, he had maintained a truce with the Crusader states while he consolidated Muslim power. That period was about to end. The Crusaders, through their own actions, would soon provide Saladin with the justification he needed to launch the jihad he had been preparing for since 1174. The moment was approaching when all of Saladin's careful political work would translate into military action, when his claims to be a jihad warrior would be tested, when the propaganda would have to become reality. The catastrophe that would destroy the Crusader field army and lead to Jerusalem's fall began with one man's greed and recklessness. Reynaud of Chatillon was everything Saladin was not: impulsive, brutal, treacherous, and motivated primarily by personal gain rather than any higher principle. A French knight who had arrived in Outremer during the Second Crusade, Reynaud had risen through marriage and violence to become Lord of Kerak, controlling a massive fortress that commanded the trade routes between Syria and Egypt. From this strategic position, Reynaud raided Muslim caravans, broke truces, and generally behaved like a bandit prince wearing a Crusader cross. Reynaud had a history of extreme actions that appalled even fellow Crusaders. In 1161, he had raided Cyprus, then a Byzantine Christian territory, torturing the Byzantine governor and slaughtering civilians despite Cyprus being Christian. He had attempted to launch naval raids into the Red Sea to attack Mecca and Medina, Islam's holiest cities, a plan so outrageous that it shocked Muslim and Christian observers alike. He had been captured by Muslims in 1161 and spent 15 years in captivity before being ransomed, apparently learning nothing from the experience except hatred. By 1186, an uneasy truce existed between Saladin's territories and the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. King Guy of Jerusalem, who had taken the throne in 1186, was a weak king surrounded by competing factions. One faction, led by Raymond of Tripoli, advocated maintaining peace with Saladin, recognizing that the Muslims now had overwhelming numerical and strategic advantages. Another faction, led by Reynold and Gerard of Ridderfort, master of the Templars, advocated aggressive action against Muslim territories. Guy, weak-willed and indecisive, was caught between these factions and unable to impose his authority on either. In late 1186 or early 1187, sources disagree on the exact date. Reynold attacked a large Muslim caravan traveling from Damascus to Cairo. This caravan was protected by the existing truce and included merchants, pilgrims, and reportedly some of Saladin's family members or close associates. Reynold seized the entire caravan, imprisoned the travelers, confiscated the goods, and refused to release the prisoners or return the goods, even when King Guy ordered him to do so. This wasn't just a breach of truce, it was an act of war and a personal insult to Saladin, who had guaranteed the caravan's safety. Saladin sent envoys to King Guy demanding Reynold release the prisoners and compensate for the losses. Guy tried to compel Reynold to comply but lacked the authority. Reynold refused, allegedly saying he was lord of his own land and would do as he pleased. This defiance gave Saladin exactly what he had been waiting for, a clear casus belli that made him the aggrieved party defending Muslim rights, rather than the aggressor breaking a truce. Reynold's treachery became the trigger for holy war. Saladin began mobilizing the largest Muslim army assembled since the First Crusade. He sent out calls to all territories under his control and to allied Muslim rulers beyond. The message was clear. The time had come for jihad. The Crusaders had broken the truce. Muslim rights had been violated. Jerusalem would be reclaimed. Warriors came from Egypt, Syria, northern Mesopotamia, and beyond. Cavalry, infantry, archers. Sources disagree on the exact size of Saladin's army, with estimates ranging from 20,000 to 40,000. But it was certainly the largest unified Muslim force the Crusaders had ever faced. The Crusader response was equally dramatic. King Guy called for mobilization of the entire kingdom's military strength. This meant not just professional knights and soldiers, but stripping castles and cities of their garrisons to field the largest possible army. The Crusader host that assembled included the king, nearly every important noble and military commander, the masters of the Templar and Hospitaller military orders with their knights, and the true cross, the relic believed to be part of Christ's actual cross, which served as the spiritual symbol of Crusader presence in the Holy Land. If this army was defeated, the Kingdom of Jerusalem would have almost no forces left to defend its cities and fortresses. The campaign that followed demonstrated Saladin's strategic patience and understanding of logistics. In late June 1187, Saladin's army crossed the Jordan River and besieged Tiberias, a Crusader town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. This was a calculated move. Tiberias was held by Raymond of Tripoli's wife Esquiva, making it impossible for Raymond to advocate simply abandoning the city. But Tiberias also occupied a position that would force any Crusader relief army to march through waterless terrain in the brutal July heat if they advanced. From their base at Safaria, the Crusader leadership debated furiously at their camp in Safaria, 16 miles west of Tiberias. Raymond of Tripoli, despite his wife being besieged, argued passionately against advancing. He understood Saladin's strategy and warned that marching to Tiberias in July, heat through territory with no water sources, would be suicidal. He advocated staying at Safaria, where the Crusaders had access to water, defensive terrain, and could force Saladin to either attack them in a defended position or abandon the siege. Even if Tiberias fell, Raymond argued, they could retake it later. But if the field army was destroyed, the entire kingdom would be lost. This advice made strategic sense, but political reality overwhelmed military wisdom. Reynaud and Gerard of Ridfort accused Raymond of cowardice and even treason, suggesting his wife was in league with Muslims. They framed remaining at Safaria as cowardly inaction while Christians were besieged. They insisted that with the true cross and God's favor, the Crusaders could not be defeated. King Guy, weak and susceptible to pressure, was convinced or bullied into ordering the advance to Tiberias. On July 3, 1187, the Crusader army began its march. It was a disaster from the start. The army numbered perhaps 20,000, including infantry and camp followers, the largest force the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever fielded. But size was irrelevant without water. The July heat was crushing, perhaps 100 degrees, 38 degrees or higher. The route from Safaria to Tiberias crossed a dry plateau with no springs or streams. The army carried water, but not enough for a day's march in such heat while wearing armor. Saladin tracked the Crusader march and immediately understood they had made a fatal mistake. He had achieved his strategic goal. The Crusader army was now committed to movement through waterless terrain, where heat and thirst would do much of his work. Muslim cavalry began harassing attacks. Archery volleys against the Crusader column, charging in to provoke response, then retreating, setting fires in the dry grass to add smoke to the heat. These attacks slowed the Crusader march, exhausted their infantry trying to defend the column, and increased water consumption. By late afternoon, July 3rd, the Crusader army was still miles from Tiberias and the Sea of Galilee's water. Crusader infantry, desperately thirsty and exhausted, were beginning to break down. The column's progress slowed to a crawl. The Crusader leadership faced an impossible choice. Continue marching toward Tiberias in darkness. Impossible with night making them even more vulnerable to attacks. Make camp without water, condemning the army to a waterless night followed by another day of march. Or retreat to Safaria, admitting defeat and abandoning Eshiva while being harassed during the retreat. King Guy made perhaps the worst possible choice. He ordered the army to make camp near the twin-peaked hill called the Horns of Hattin, still 6 miles from Tiberias and water. The army spent a night of agony, no water, surrounded by Muslim forces who shot arrows and shouted insults, watching fires burning around them, knowing that morning would bring battle while they were already defeated by thirst and exhaustion. July 4th, 1187, dawned murderously hot. The Crusader army was surrounded on the waterless plateau, desperate with thirst, and facing a fresh, well-supplied Muslim army that had spent the night near water sources. What happened next was less a battle than a systematic destruction. Saladin deployed his forces in a crescent formation surrounding the Crusaders and began a relentless archery barrage. Muslim archers, a huge advantage Saladin's army had, poured arrows into the Crusader formations from all sides. The Crusader infantry, driven mad by thirst, broke formation and attempted to fight their way toward Tiberias and water. Muslim cavalry cut them down or drove them back. The Crusader knights attempted several cavalry charges to break through the Muslim encirclement, but horses, as well as men, were weakened by thirst and heat. Each charge was met with archery that killed horses and wounded riders, then counterattacks by Muslim cavalry that drove the Crusaders back. Gradually, the Crusader army disintegrated into separate groups, fighting desperately against encircling Muslim forces. By afternoon, it was over. The Crusader infantry had largely been killed or captured. The knights had retreated to the horns of Hattin's peaks where they made final stands. King Guy's tent was overrun, and the true cross was captured, an immense symbolic blow. Guy himself, Raymond of Tripoli, Reynaud of Chatillon, Gerard of Ridfort, and most of the surviving Crusader nobility were captured. Of the 20,000-man Crusader army, only a few small groups managed to escape. The rest were dead or prisoner. The aftermath revealed Saladin's character in its complexity. That evening, in Saladin's tent, the captured Crusader leaders were brought before him. King Guy, terrified and dehydrated, was given water to drink, a gesture of mercy under Islamic law that meant Guy's life would be spared, as offering water to a captive created an obligation not to kill them. Guy drank desperately, then passed the cup to Reynaud of Chatillon sitting beside him. Saladin reportedly interrupted sharply. "You did not ask permission. This king gives him water, not I." The distinction was crucial. Saladin had sworn previously to kill Reynaud personally for his treachery and violations of Islamic law. Now, despite Reynaud being a prisoner, Saladin kept that oath. He offered Reynaud conversion to Islam, which Reynaud refused. Saladin then struck him with his sword. Some sources say he beheaded Reynaud personally, others that he only wounded him and guards finished the execution. But the result was the same. Reynaud of Chatillon died in Saladin's tent, executed for his crimes against Muslim travelers and repeated truce violations. Saladin then turned to King Guy, who thought he was next. Saladin reassured him, "A king does not kill a king. That man was guilty, and therefore I killed him." Guy would be ransomed later, treated well in captivity according to Islamic law, and Saladin's sense of proper conduct toward noble prisoners. There was one exception to this mercy: the military orders. Saladin ordered the execution of all captured Knights Templar and Hospitaller, the military religious orders that had been the most effective Crusader fighters. Saladin considered these men not ordinary warriors, but religious fanatics who would never stop fighting Muslims. He had them executed en masse the day after the battle. This was calculated policy, eliminating the most dangerous long-term enemies. But it was still mass execution of prisoners, a dark note in Saladin's reputation. Hattin was one of medieval history's most decisive battles. In a single day, Saladin had destroyed the Crusader field army, captured or killed most of the Kingdom of Jerusalem's military leadership, taken the True Cross, and left the Crusader territories almost defenseless. The strategic consequences unfolded rapidly. Without a field army to oppose him, Saladin could besiege Crusader cities and fortresses one by one, and most lacked sufficient garrison to resist long sieges. Within weeks, Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and dozens of smaller fortifications surrendered or were captured. Some negotiated surrender and were granted safe passage. Others resisted and were taken by force. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem was collapsing. By September 1187, only Jerusalem itself, Tyre, defended by Conrad of Montferrat, who had arrived with reinforcements just in time, and a handful of isolated castles remained in Crusader hands. The road to Jerusalem, the campaign Saladin had been building toward for 13 years, the jihad he had used to justify his conquest of Muslim territories, the religious obligation that had legitimized his entire political project, was now open. The question was no longer whether Saladin could recapture Jerusalem, but how he would do it, and what would happen afterward. The reconquest of Islam's third holiest city would be Saladin's supreme achievement, the act that would secure his historical reputation and confirm his propaganda claims. Everything had been building toward this moment. Jerusalem had been in Crusader hands since July 15th, 1099, when the First Crusade culminated in one of medieval history's most horrific massacres. The Crusaders had breached the walls after a desperate month-long siege, and what followed was slaughter on a scale that shocked even medieval observers accustomed to violence. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants of the city were killed without distinction: men, women, children, elderly. Crusader chronicles, written by people sympathetic to the crusade, described blood running in the streets ankle-deep, knights riding through blood up to their horses' bridles, and slaughter so total that the Crusaders had difficulty finding survivors to clear the bodies. This history hung over Jerusalem in September 1187 as Saladin's army approached. The city's Christian inhabitants knew exactly what Muslims could do to them in revenge. The precedent of 1099 suggested that when a city was taken by storm after resistance, the attacking army had the right to sack it completely. killing, enslaving, and plundering at will. This was standard medieval siege warfare law, accepted by all sides. Jerusalem's Christians had reason to expect annihilation in reprisal for what their ancestors had done 88 years before. Jerusalem's military situation was hopeless. Balian of Ibelin, a capable nobleman who had survived Hattin and made his way to Jerusalem, led the defense. But he commanded fewer than 2,000 knights and soldiers, many of them inexperienced, against Saladin's battle-hardened army of tens of thousands fresh from victory at Hattin. The city's walls were strong, but walls required defenders, and Jerusalem didn't have enough. More problematically, the city's population included tens of thousands of refugees who had fled there from other captured territories, straining food and water supplies. Saladin began his siege in late September 1187, surrounding the city and positioning siege engines. Before launching a full assault, he offered terms: surrender the city peacefully, and the Christians would be allowed to leave safely with their portable possessions upon payment of a ransom. This was generous by medieval siege standards. Saladin was offering exactly what Crusaders had not offered Muslim defenders in 1099. But the initial ransom demand was high: 10 dinars per man, 5 per woman, 1 per child. For a poor family, this was impossible. The defenders rejected the offer and vowed to resist. Some threatened to destroy the dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, if the city fell, though whether this was serious or negotiating bluster remains unclear. More practically, they warned that rather than surrender, they would kill all Muslim prisoners in the city, destroy everything of value, and then sally out to die fighting, ensuring that Saladin would capture only ruins and corpses rather than an intact city. Saladin took these threats seriously. He wanted Jerusalem both as a religious duty, reclaiming the holy site where the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended to heaven, and as a political symbol, but he wanted it intact and wanted the process to enhance rather than damage his reputation for justice and mercy. A massacre of Christians in Jerusalem, even in revenge for 1099, would tarnish his reputation and potentially unite Christian Europe in a new crusade. Saladin understood that how he took Jerusalem mattered as much as taking it. The military phase of the siege was brief but intense. Saladin's engineers identified a weak section of wall on the northern side and concentrated their efforts there. Siege engines battered the walls while miners dug tunnels underneath to collapse sections. On September 29, 1187, after less than a week of assault, a section of wall collapsed. Saladin's forces could have stormed through and taken the city by force. Instead, Saladin called for renewed negotiations. The terms shifted significantly. Balian of Ibelin came to Saladin's tent to negotiate directly. The discussions revealed Saladin's understanding of political theatre and practical politics. He knew that a sacked Jerusalem would create martyrs and fuel Christian desire for revenge. He also knew that gracious terms would demonstrate Islamic superiority and put Christians in his debt. After extended negotiation, terms were reached that were astonishingly generous. Ransom would be reduced to 10 dinars per man, 5 per woman and 1 per child. And for those who couldn't pay, Saladin would personally pay ransom for 7,000 poor people. The remaining poor who couldn't pay would become slaves under Islamic law, but Saladin and his brother would eventually free most of them as well. On October 2nd, 1187-88, years to the day after Jerusalem fell to the First Crusade, Saladin's forces entered the city peacefully. What followed was a remarkable contrast to 1099. There was no massacre. Christian civilians were not killed. Churches were not destroyed. The city's Christian residents were organized for safe departure. Rich Christians paid their ransom and left with their possessions. Poor Christians who could pay nothing were ransomed by Saladin's funds or freed. Some became slaves but were generally treated well, and many were freed. Later, Saladin's emirs and soldiers were reportedly disappointed by this mercy. They had expected to plunder a wealthy city and instead were ordered to maintain discipline. Saladin held firm. He allowed Muslims to reclaim their holy sites. The Dome of the Rock was purified, the cross that Crusaders had placed on top was removed, and the area was restored to Islamic worship. But churches like the Holy Sepulchre, while no longer used as churches, were not destroyed. Christian holy sites were preserved, though controlled by Muslims. The process of evacuating Jerusalem's Christian population took weeks. Patriarch Heraclius, the highest-ranking Christian cleric, famously paid his ransom of 10 dinars, but left the city with carts loaded with gold and valuables from church treasuries, leaving poor Christians in slavery. Saladin could have seized these treasures legally under the siege terms, but he let them go, apparently seeing Heraclius's hypocrisy as its own punishment, and another example of Christian leaders' moral failure compared to Muslim generosity. Some Christians couldn't afford ransom and became slaves. Estimates suggest between 11,000 and 15,000 Christians fell into slavery when they couldn't pay, but Saladin personally freed many, as did his brother Al-Adil, who was so moved by the sight of families being separated that he asked Saladin for 1,000 slaves as a gift, then immediately freed them all. Other emirs followed this example, and many of those initially enslaved were freed within weeks or months. It was political theatre, but it was effective theatre that demonstrated Islamic mercy contrasted with Crusader brutality. The strategic calculation behind this mercy was sophisticated. Saladin understood that every other Crusader city was watching Jerusalem's fate. By treating Jerusalem's Christians well, Saladin encouraged other cities to surrender peacefully rather than resist to the death. Over the following months, Ascalon, Gaza, and numerous smaller fortifications surrendered to Saladin on generous terms, specifically because of Jerusalem's example. Had Saladin sacked Jerusalem, every remaining Crusader stronghold would have fought desperately, costing Muslim lives and delaying final victory. The propaganda value was equally important. News of Jerusalem's fall with minimal Christian bloodshed spread throughout the Muslim world and Christian Europe. Muslim observers praised Saladin's piety and mercy, confirming his reputation as a just Islamic ruler. Even Christian chroniclers, while lamenting Jerusalem's loss, praised Saladin's conduct. Contemporary Christian writers described him as chivalrous, merciful, and honorable. Extraordinary praise for a Muslim enemy from medieval Christian authors who typically demonized Muslims. One chronicler wrote that Saladin had a heart more Christian than those who bore the cross. This reputation had practical consequences. When the Third Crusade was eventually launched, European knights were fighting not a demonic Muslim enemy, but a respected adversary whose honor matched or exceeded their own. This complicated the usual crusade propaganda, portraying Muslims as evil infidels deserving extermination. Saladin had successfully positioned himself as the moral superior to the Crusaders, turning what could have been simple religious war into a more complex conflict where both sides had claims to justice and righteousness. The purification of Jerusalem's Islamic holy sites was conducted with ceremony designed to emphasize that this was a religious restoration, not political conquest. The Dome of the Rock, which Crusaders had converted into a church they called Templum Domini, was ritually cleansed with rose water brought from Damascus. The cross atop the dome was removed and dragged through the city streets. Humiliating display that nevertheless stopped short of destruction of Christian symbols outside the immediate holy site. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which had served as royal palace and Templar headquarters, was restored to Islamic worship. The minbar, pulpit, that Nur al-Din had commissioned years earlier, specifically for Jerusalem's eventual reconquest, was installed, a powerful symbol of continuous jihad finally achieved. Saladin commissioned inscriptions celebrating the conquest that framed it explicitly as divinely ordained jihad. One inscription proclaimed that God had purified Jerusalem from the pollution of polytheists, a standard Islamic term for Christians because of the Trinity doctrine, through the agency of his servant Saladin. These inscriptions served both as religious celebration and political legitimization. Saladin was fulfilling divine will, not just satisfying personal ambition. The fall of Jerusalem shocked Christian Europe. Pope Urban III reportedly died of grief upon hearing the news. Pope Gregory X immediately called for a new crusade, the Third Crusade, to reclaim the Holy City. This crusade would attract Europe's most powerful monarchs: Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Philip II of France, and Richard I of England. The response Saladin had partially intended to forestall through his mercy was coming anyway, because losing Jerusalem was intolerable to Christian Europe, regardless of how graciously Muslims had conquered it. But Saladin had achieved his central goal. Jerusalem was Muslim again, the city that had been the emotional and religious heart of the Crusader states, the holy city whose loss had sparked the First Crusade, whose occupation had justified decades of Crusader presence in the Levant, was back in Muslim hands. Saladin had fulfilled the promise he had made years earlier when justifying his conquest of Muslim territories. He had prosecuted jihad. He had reclaimed Jerusalem. He had vindicated his entire political project. The Kurdish soldier who had reluctantly marched to Egypt 23 years earlier had become the man who retook Jerusalem. The administrator, who had seemed destined for modest success, had achieved what no Muslim leader since 1099 had accomplished. The Sultan, who had spent years fighting fellow Muslims, could now claim he had been right all along. That unity was necessary, that his rule was divinely ordained, that jihad had been the purpose. October 2nd, 1187 was the peak of Saladin's career, the achievement that would define his historical legacy. The moment when all the politics and compromises and morally ambiguous conquests could be retroactively justified as necessary steps toward holy triumph. But the story was not over. Christian Europe would respond with the largest crusade yet assembled, and Saladin would face his greatest challenge: Richard the Lionheart, warrior king of England, military genius, and the man who would test whether Saladin's reputation as an invincible commander was deserved or merely propaganda. The Third Crusade began with disaster and papal fury. Pope Gregory VIII's call for a new crusade to reclaim Jerusalem mobilized Europe's most powerful monarchs. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and perhaps Europe's greatest military leader, took the cross and marched east with a massive German army in 1189. But in June 1190, while crossing a river in Anatolia, the elderly emperor drowned. His army dissolved. Some turned back. Others marched to the Holy Land, but arrived as fragments of the original force. The greatest threat to Saladin had eliminated itself through accident before even reaching Crusader territory. Philip II of France and Richard I of England arrived in the Levant in 1191 with the bulk of the Third Crusade's force. Both were capable commanders. But Richard was something extraordinary, a warrior king who led from the front, a tactical genius who understood both cavalry charges and siege warfare, and a man with an almost supernatural reputation for personal combat prowess. Medieval chroniclers on both sides described Richard in terms usually reserved for legendary heroes. He was tall, strong, fearless in combat, and possessed what modern militaries would call operational brilliance: the ability to see the larger strategic picture while managing tactical details. Saladin was 54 years old when Richard arrived. Aging by medieval standards and exhausted by decades of constant campaigning, Richard was 34 in his physical prime, with energy that seemed inexhaustible. The contrast would define their confrontation: the veteran sultan who had built an empire through patient, political warfare versus the warrior king, who believed problems could be solved through decisive military action. Their first major confrontation was the siege of Acre. This crucial port city, captured by Saladin in 1187, had been under siege by Crusaders since 1189, before Richard arrived. The siege was a miserable stalemate. Crusaders surrounded Acre from the land side, but Saladin's armies surrounded the Crusaders, creating a bizarre double siege, where the Crusaders besieging Acre were themselves besieged by Saladin. Disease, starvation, and periodic battles had killed tens of thousands on all sides, yet the city held out for 2 years. Richard's arrival in June 1191 changed everything. He immediately took command, organized the siege systematically, and brought new siege engines and energy to the assault. Philip II of France was also present, but clearly secondary to Richard in both military skill and force of personality. Under Richard's direction, the siege engines battered Acre's walls relentlessly. Saladin attempted to break the siege from the outside, launching attacks on the Crusader siege lines, but couldn't penetrate their fortifications. Inside Acre, the garrison was starving and running out of ammunition. On July 12, 1191, Acre surrendered to Richard and Philip on terms. The garrison would be spared if Saladin returned the true cross, paid a large ransom, and released Christian prisoners. Saladin agreed to these terms, but delayed delivery, apparently trying to negotiate modifications. This delay led to one of the most controversial episodes of the Third Crusade. On August 20th, after nearly 6 weeks of waiting, and with Philip already departed for France, Richard ordered the execution of approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners from Acre's garrison. The execution was conducted in view of Saladin's army, a deliberate message that Richard would not tolerate delays. This massacre was militarily logical, but morally appalling. Richard calculated that he couldn't leave Acre with thousands of Muslim prisoners requiring guards when he needed every soldier for his march south toward Jerusalem. He also couldn't release them to rejoin Saladin's army. The execution was Richard sending Saladin a brutal message about the new reality. The Crusaders had a commander who would not be restrained by chivalric norms or mercy. Saladin was reportedly horrified, and later sources suggest he executed some Christian prisoners in retaliation, though the details are disputed. The massacre at Acre revealed that the conflict between Richard and Saladin would be fundamentally different from the earlier phases of the Crusades. These were two leaders who understood war not as glorious adventure but as brutal necessity. Both were capable of calculated cruelty. Both would kill when killing served their purposes. The romanticization of their conflict as a chivalric duel between noble knights obscures the reality that this was total war, conducted by pragmatic professionals willing to do terrible things to win. After taking Acre, Richard began his march south along the coast toward Jaffa, with the eventual goal of advancing inland to Jerusalem. Saladin shadowed the Crusader army, refusing to give Richard the decisive battle the English king wanted. Saladin understood that Richard's army, though powerful, was outnumbered. If Saladin could avoid a pitched battle, launch constant harassing attacks, destroy supplies, and wear down the Crusaders through attrition, the invaders would eventually exhaust themselves and have to retreat. Richard understood this strategy and countered it brilliantly. He marched his army in tight formation, with heavy infantry protecting the vulnerable knights and horses from Muslim archery. The march was slow but disciplined, moving only short distances each day, staying close to the coast where Crusader ships could resupply them. Saladin's cavalry harassed them constantly. Archery attacks, false charges meant to provoke premature Crusader counterattacks, anything to break the disciplined march formation. Richard forbade his knights to break formation, regardless of provocation, understanding that the moment his army's organization dissolved, Saladin's superior numbers would overwhelm them. This cat-and-mouse game culminated at the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191. Saladin positioned his entire army across the Crusaders' line of march, blocking the way to Jaffa. This was the decisive battle Richard had been seeking. The day began with massive Muslim archery barrages against the Crusader column. Richard's infantry maintained formation, but the heavily armored knights were desperate to charge. Remaining stationary under arrow fire felt like cowardice, and horses were being wounded and killed. The pressure built throughout the morning. The Hospitallers, forming the rear guard, finally broke discipline and charged without orders, unable to endure the archery any longer. Richard, seeing that his careful plan was collapsing, immediately adapted. He ordered a general cavalry charge along the entire line, turning what could have been a disaster of piecemeal charges into a coordinated assault. The Crusader knights, finally unleashed, smashed into the Muslim lines with devastating impact. The Battle of Arsuf was Saladin's most significant battlefield defeat. His army broke under the Crusader charge and retreated in disorder. Richard had proven that Saladin was not invincible, that Muslim cavalry could not simply harass Crusaders to death, and that in a direct collision between heavily armored Crusader knights and lighter Muslim cavalry, the Crusaders had the advantage. The battle didn't destroy Saladin's army, most escaped, but it broke the psychological momentum Saladin had enjoyed since Hattin. Richard followed up by capturing Jaffa and rebuilding its fortifications, establishing a secure coastal base. He then began preparations for the advance on Jerusalem just 40 miles inland. This was the moment when the Third Crusade seemed poised to accomplish its primary goal, recapturing the Holy City. But Richard faced a strategic problem that would ultimately prove insurmountable. Jerusalem was not near the coast. Advancing inland meant leaving behind the sea-based supply line that had sustained the march from Acre to Jaffa. The territory between the coast and Jerusalem was controlled by Saladin, who would employ scorched earth tactics, destroying food and water sources. Even if Richard captured Jerusalem, holding it would require a permanent garrison and a supply line from the coast through hostile territory. Every castle, every village, every water source would need to be captured and garrisoned. Richard had insufficient troops to simultaneously capture Jerusalem, garrison it, hold the supply line, and maintain the coastal cities. Saladin understood this perfectly. He didn't need to defeat Richard in battle. He needed to make capturing Jerusalem strategically untenable. Saladin dismantled the fortifications of every castle and stronghold between the coast and Jerusalem, denying Richard defensible positions. He strengthened Jerusalem's defenses and stockpiled supplies for a long siege. He positioned his army to threaten Richard's supply lines. The message was clear: you can march on Jerusalem, but you cannot take it. And if you try, your army will starve in the hills while I cut off your retreat. Richard advanced to within 12 miles of Jerusalem twice, once in December 1191 and again in June 1192. Both times, after consulting with his commanders and local barons familiar with the territory, he concluded that attacking Jerusalem would be a fatal mistake. The city's defenses were too strong, the logistics were impossible, and even if the Crusaders took Jerusalem, they couldn't hold it. Richard made the agonizing decision to turn back both times without even attempting the siege. This decision required immense moral courage. Richard's entire purpose for coming on crusade was to reclaim Jerusalem. His reputation, his religious duty, and his army's morale all demanded that he at least try. Turning back while the holy city was visible on the horizon broke the hearts of his soldiers and damaged his reputation among those who didn't understand the strategic impossibility. But Richard understood what many romantic chroniclers did not. Attempting and failing to take Jerusalem would destroy his army, whereas preserving his army gave the Crusader states a chance to survive, even without recapturing the holy city. During these years of military stalemate, Richard and Saladin developed a complicated relationship. They never met in person. Medieval protocol and security concerns made such a meeting impossible, but they exchanged messages, embassies, and even gifts. Each respected the other's military skill and personal honor, even while fighting desperately. When Richard fell ill during the campaign, Saladin sent his personal physician and fresh fruit. When Richard's horse was killed under him in battle, Saladin sent replacement horses so Richard could continue. Fighting, killing Richard while he was unhorsed, would have been militarily smart but apparently dishonored Saladin's sense of how a noble enemy should be treated. This mutual respect created one of history's most interesting might-have-beens, the proposed marriage alliance. At one point in negotiations, Richard proposed that his sister Joan marry Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, that the couple receive Jerusalem as a joint domain, and that Christians and Muslims share control of the holy city. This proposal was either a genuine negotiating position or a cynical ploy to divide Saladin's advisors. Historians debate which. Joan furiously refused to marry a Muslim, and Saladin's Islamic advisors rejected the idea as unthinkable. The proposal went nowhere, but it indicated the degree to which Richard and Saladin were thinking beyond simple military conquest toward political solutions. What eventually ended the Third Crusade was not military defeat, but European politics. Richard received news from England that his brother John was conspiring with Philip II of France to seize Richard's kingdom while he was on crusade. Richard needed to return to Europe immediately to protect his throne. Saladin was also exhausted. He was now 56, had been campaigning almost continuously for 5 years, and his health was declining. Both men needed the war to end. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, formalized a compromise that satisfied neither side but acknowledged the military stalemate. The Crusaders would keep the coastal cities from Tyre to Jaffa, giving the Kingdom of Jerusalem a viable territorial base and access to sea trade. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would have free access to visit holy sites. The treaty was supposed to last 3 years, but it effectively ended the Third Crusade. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192, never to return. His journey home became its own legend. He was captured in Austria, held for ransom, and didn't return to England until 1194. But he never launched another crusade, despite original plans to do so. Saladin returned to Damascus, exhausted and aging, his health broken by decades of warfare. The two greatest military commanders of their era had fought each other to a stalemate. Neither had won decisively, but both had achieved something. Richard had saved the Crusader states from total annihilation, and Saladin had kept Jerusalem in Muslim hands. The conflict between Richard and Saladin became legendary even in their own lifetimes. Chroniclers on both sides wrote of their encounters with admiration and respect unusual in medieval religious warfare. The lion and the eagle, Richard's Plantagenet lion against Saladin's eagle emblem, became symbols of chivalric conflict, noble enemies who fought fiercely but respected each other's honor. Later, European romances and Eastern epics embellished their relationship, creating legends of secret meetings, noble gestures, and knightly contests that probably never happened, but captured something true about how these two men elevated their conflict above simple religious hatred. The reality was more complex than legend. Both men were capable of ruthless cruelty. Richard's massacre at Acre, Saladin's execution of military order prisoners after Hattin. Both were pragmatic politicians using religious war for state-building purposes. But both also demonstrated genuine commitment to their respective faiths' ideals of just warfare and honorable conduct toward worthy enemies. They represented medieval chivalry at both its best: mutual respect, personal courage, adherence to codes of honor, and its worst, religiously motivated warfare, massacres of non-combatants, enslavement of defeated populations. The Third Crusade ended without achieving its stated goal of recapturing Jerusalem, but it prevented Saladin from completely destroying the Crusader states. When Richard departed, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was reduced to a coastal strip, but it survived. That survival meant the Crusader presence in the Levant would continue for another century, eventually falling to the Mamluks in 1291. Saladin had come close to ending the Crusades in his lifetime, but hadn't quite succeeded. Richard had prevented that ending, but hadn't reversed Saladin's victories. The stalemate of 1192 would define the Levantine political situation for a generation after both men were dead. The war with Richard broke Saladin's health. Throughout the Third Crusade, Saladin had driven himself relentlessly, personally commanding forces in multiple theaters, managing coalition politics among his emirs, maintaining supply lines across his empire, and handling diplomatic negotiations with Christian powers. The physical and mental strain on a man in his mid-50s took an inevitable toll. By the time the Treaty of Jaffa was signed in September 1192, Saladin was visibly exhausted and aging beyond his years. Saladin returned to Damascus in October 1192 and resumed his administrative duties, but he no longer had the energy for military campaigns. He spent his final months managing his empire, resolving disputes between his relatives who governed different provinces, and enjoying the company of religious scholars. According to biographers, Saladin lived simply even after his greatest victories, maintaining a modest household despite ruling a wealthy empire. He gave away most of his income to charity, supporting the poor, funding religious institutions, and rewarding soldiers and officials. This generosity, while admirable, left his personal finances in chronic deficit. In late February 1193, Saladin fell ill with a fever, probably typhoid or similar disease, though medieval medical knowledge makes precise diagnosis impossible. His condition deteriorated rapidly over the next week. Religious scholars and family members gathered at his bedside as his health failed. On March 4, 1193, Saladin died surrounded by prayers and Quranic recitations. He was 55 years old and had ruled Egypt for 24 years, Syria for 19 years, and had kept Jerusalem in Muslim hands for nearly 6 years. The inventory of his estate revealed the extraordinary fact that shocked contemporaries and fascinated historians ever since. Saladin died nearly penniless. His treasury contained 47 dirhams of silver and 1 gold dinar, not enough to pay for his own funeral. The man who had ruled from Egypt to Mesopotamia, who commanded the revenues of dozens of wealthy cities, who had received tribute from rulers across the Muslim world, had given away everything. His son Al-Afdal had to borrow money to bury his father with appropriate ceremony. When this financial situation became known, it cemented Saladin's reputation for generosity and unworldliness, but it also created immediate practical problems for his dynasty. The Ayyubid Empire that Saladin had spent decades building began fragmenting almost immediately upon his death. The unity he had imposed through personal authority, military success, and carefully balanced family politics dissolved when the unifying personality vanished. Saladin had divided his territories among his sons and brothers, hoping family loyalty would maintain cohesion. Instead, within years, his relatives were fighting each other for control of Egypt and Syria. Al-Afdal, who inherited Damascus and should have been senior, lacked his father's political skill and military reputation. Al-Aziz Uthman, who received Egypt, was more capable but died young. Al-Adil, Saladin's brother, eventually outmaneuvered his nephews and reunited most of the empire under his own rule, becoming Sultan and marginalizing Saladin's sons. This political fragmentation meant that Saladin's dream of permanent Muslim unity against the Crusaders died with him. The Ayyubid dynasty he founded would rule Egypt and Syria for several more decades, but never with the coordinated purpose and centralized authority Saladin had maintained. Later, Crusades would face Ayyubid forces, but never again the unified command and strategic vision that Saladin had provided. In this sense, Saladin's political achievement was entirely personal, dependent on his leadership rather than institutionally sustainable. Yet Saladin's military achievement proved more lasting. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, not just until the end of the Ayyubid dynasty, but for another 700 years until British conquest in 1917. The Third Crusade failed to recapture the Holy City, and subsequent crusades, despite some temporary successes like Frederick II's negotiated recovery of Jerusalem in 1229, never permanently restored Christian rule. The strategic situation Saladin created, Muslim control of Jerusalem and the interior territory of Palestine with Crusader states reduced to coastal strips, defined the region's politics for the next century until the Mamluks finally destroyed the last Crusader strongholds. More profound than his political or military legacies was Saladin's cultural and mythological impact. Even before his death, Saladin had become legendary. Muslim poets and chroniclers celebrated him as the champion of jihad, the just ruler, and the model of Islamic virtue. Within decades, stories about Saladin's generosity, wisdom, and piety circulated throughout the Muslim world. Some were historical, many were embellished, some were complete fabrication. But together, they created a legendary figure who represented Islam's ideal ruler. Pious, but not fanatical, just but not weak, generous to friends and merciful to defeated enemies, successful in war, but motivated by righteousness rather than conquest. What's remarkable is that Christian Europe also adopted Saladin as a legendary figure, but for different reasons. Crusader chroniclers, despite writing for a Christian audience that had lost Jerusalem to this Muslim commander, consistently portrayed Saladin with respect and admiration. They praised his chivalry, his mercy at Jerusalem, his generous treatment of prisoners, and his honorable conduct toward Richard the Lionheart. This praise was partly contrasting Saladin with Christian rulers who failed to match his virtues, but it was also genuine respect for a worthy enemy who embodied chivalric ideals better than many Christians. By the late medieval period, Saladin had become incorporated into European chivalric literature as an honorary knight, the model of how even a non-Christian could embody knightly virtues. Dante's Divine Comedy placed Saladin in limbo with virtuous pagans rather than hell. Extraordinary honor for a Muslim who had defeated Christian armies. Later, Renaissance writers portrayed Saladin as the noble adversary, the good Muslim, whose virtues Christianity could appreciate even while rejecting his religion. This incorporation of Saladin into Western chivalric ideals created the strange situation where Saladin was simultaneously Islam's greatest jihad warrior and Europe's model of knightly virtue. The modern era added new layers to Saladin's mythology. In the 19th century, as European colonial powers conquered the Middle East, Saladin became a symbol for Arab and Muslim resistance. Nationalist movements invoked Saladin as the historical precedent for Muslims defeating European invaders. The fact that Saladin was ethnically Kurdish rather than Arab was conveniently forgotten or minimized. Saladin became whatever modern nationalists needed: the Arab hero, the Muslim unifier, the anti-colonial resistance fighter, the proof that Islam could defeat the West. Various modern political movements have claimed Saladin's legacy. Arab nationalists saw him as the model for pan-Arab unity against Western imperialism. Islamist movements pointed to his combination of piety and military success, as proving that strict adherence to Islam leads to victory. Turkish nationalists emphasized his service to Turkish dynasties. Kurdish activists reclaimed him as a Kurdish hero. The secular Syrian government of Hafez al-Assad erected a massive statue of Saladin in Damascus, positioning the regime as Saladin's heir, defending Arab land against Western-backed Israel. Everyone wanted to claim Saladin, though often the Saladin they claimed was more myth than history. This raises the question, what is Saladin's real legacy? Stripped of 800 years of myth-making from all sides, what did this medieval commander actually achieve? Militarily, he unified Muslim territories that had been divided, destroyed a Crusader field army at Hattin, recaptured Jerusalem, and fought the Third Crusade to a strategic stalemate. These are significant achievements that changed the region's political and military situation for generations. Politically, he founded the Ayyubid dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria for decades and established a model of leadership combining religious legitimacy with military power. But perhaps his most lasting legacy is representational. Saladin demonstrated that Muslims could defeat Crusaders decisively, that jihad could be both spiritually meaningful and militarily successful, and that Islamic rulers could embody virtues, justice, mercy, generosity, that even their Christian enemies had to acknowledge. He became proof that Muslims could compete with Christian Europe on its own claimed terms of civilization and chivalry. This was particularly important during later periods of Muslim weakness and European colonial dominance. Saladin's example offered historical evidence that current weakness was not inevitable or permanent. The man who died nearly penniless in Damascus in 1193 became more powerful in death than in life. Historical Saladin, the Kurdish soldier who reluctantly marched to Egypt, the cautious politician who conquered Muslim territories before turning on the Crusaders, the capable commander who understood logistics as well as tactics, the ruler who combined genuine piety with political calculation, remains fascinating. But mythological Saladin, the perfect Muslim ruler, the chivalric knight in Saracen form, the symbol of resistance and Unity has shaped history more powerfully than the historical figure ever could. Saladin remains relevant today, not because of what he actually did in the 12th century, but because what he represents to so many groups. The possibility of Muslim unity, the example of defeating external threats, the model of combining religious devotion with worldly success, the proof that military power and moral virtue can coexist. Different groups emphasize different aspects of his legacy, often in contradiction with each other, but all invoke his name and authority. The Kurdish soldier who became a sultan, who united an empire and reclaimed a holy city, who showed mercy when vengeance was expected, who fought Richard the Lionheart to a stalemate, who gave away his wealth and died in poverty. This man created a legend that has outlived his empire, his dynasty, and his political achievements. 8 centuries after his death, Saladin remains what he became in his own lifetime, both historical figure and timeless symbol, both man and myth, both the reality of medieval power politics and the ideal of righteous leadership. That duality, more than any battle or conquest, is Saladin's true legacy.